Welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we are diving deep into one of the most significant pieces of psychedelic history, the legendary Shulgin Farm and the remarkable legacy of Sasha and Ann Shulgin. Our guest is Wendy Tucker, who brings us an intimate perspective as Ann Shulgin's daughter and as someone who worked closely with Sasha on the Shulgin Farm. As board chair of Shulgin Farm and the owner of Transform Press, Wendy is now leading efforts to preserve this historic property where over 200 novel psychedelic compounds were first synthesized. As part of this episode, we explore the fascinating history of the Shulgin Farm since 1935, the beautiful love story between Sasha and Ann, and the groundbreaking scientific work that happened in Sasha's famous lab. Wendy shares personal stories about growing up around these pioneering research and details the current efforts to transform the property into a living museum and gathering space for the psychedelic community. Wendy is an artist who worked for many years with Sasha doing research and working in his lab while running Transform Press, the publishing company that her parents created. Today, she manages a chiropractic office in Fairfax in Marin County while spearheading efforts to preserve this important piece of psychedelic history through the nonprofit Shulgin Farm, which she created in 2023. So in our conversation together, we discussed the rich history and significance of the Shulgin Farm property, intimate stories about Sasha and Ann's relationship and work, behind-the-scenes details about Sasha's methodical approach to creating novel psychedelic compounds, the 1994 DEA raid and its impact on the Shulgin research, and current preservation efforts and the vision for the farm's future. I actually had the chance to visit the farm back in the summer of 2024, saw the lab, checked out some of the spaces that they're building out, the main house and property. Was in Sasha's office and saw a lot of his old books and papers, paintings around the house. It was just cool to go to the Shulgin Farm that's in Lafayette in the East Bay of California and check it out and be part of history. So it really was an honor to have Wendy on the show and talk about the Shulgin Farm. All right, here we go. Let's get into it with Wendy Tucker. Hey listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we have Wendy Tucker. Wendy is the board chair of Shulgin Farm and the owner of Transform Press. And at the moment, she is spearheading the effort to preserve the farm, which was the home of Sasha and Ann Shulgin, Wendy's mother, and the location of Sasha's historic lab. And I wanted to bring her on to both bring awareness around the preservation efforts, but also to talk a little bit about Sasha and Ann and the story of the Shulgins, because the lore of it, I think, is so imperative in this sort of current psychedelic renaissance. So Wendy, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here.
So a few months ago, just by chance, I was in the Bay Area, just down the way from Lafayette, and a mutual friend of ours, Peter Vitale, who has been supporting you with efforts to preserve the Shulgin Farm, introduced us and was like, Paul, you really should go check it out. And I, had always seen photos of the Shulgin Farm and obviously had heard stories of the lab and Sasha's experiments. And so it was really cool to be able to see the place for itself. And I'm just curious, just as an opening question, tell us a little bit about the history of the Shulgin Farm. How did that property come to be in the Shulgin family, and how has it developed over the last generations?
Well, Sasha's family got that property in 1935. So,
Wow.
Yeah, we found a very old photo, really grainy, and it shows the whole area from up top the hill, and it says, "This is the ranch when we began," or something to that effect. And it's great because you can really see there was nothing around. But, Sasha, his first few years were in Berkeley, and they got that spot in Lafayette and lived there until the house burned down in the early 50s.
Oh, wow.
And this is a little thing. We're sort of trying to uncover the history around this particular story. In fact, there's somebody who's been Doug Rail, who's been working with us, has been going around the property, finding some evidence of the old fire, and so it's this unknown part of the history. But the original house burned down, I think, in the early 50s, and then Sasha and his father built the house that stands there now, a little ways down the path. And so they designed that house, built it, laid the bricks. I'm sure they had help, but boy, oh boy, what an amazing house. And so where the original house was ended up being Sasha's lab. He used the basement or the tool shed of that original structure. When he left Dow in the 60s, he took that remaining part and put his lab there. So it's a small space. It's probably 10 or 15 by 10 feet, but big enough for 1 or 2 people to be working in there. And once you have all your equipment and everything you need, it's a beautifully functioning spot. So that space saw a lot of magic happen from the 60s all the way up until Sasha passed. So that property is really special. It's a beautiful spot. You can see Mount Diablo right from the dining room window, and it's overlooking the valley, and it's a beautiful piece of property. It used to be, they call it the farm because it actually used to be a farm, and they've tried growing all sorts of fruit trees, and I believe had some animals early on, but that didn't last, and it's terribly hard to grow things out there with all the gophers and the heat.
Right. Well, and what stuck out to me as well is when coming in, I believe the farm's address is on Shulgin Road, which I thought was super interesting.
Right.
Do you know how that is? Was just that no one else was out there and they sort of were able to basically name their own street?
Yeah, I think, early on they didn't need to. And at some point the post office or the county said, you have to create an address here. And so they called it Shulgin Road, and they just picked a number randomly, which is really funny. So there is one neighbor just to the north of us. I think both those houses were there when they actually named the road, but since Sasha's family was there the longest, they named it Shulgin Road. Yeah.
So our listeners have definitely heard of Sasha, right? And, he's probably best known for writing TiHKAL and PiHKAL, which on that front cover has a photo of Mount Diablo. He patented, was fortunate enough to get an incredible patent early in his career through Dow Chemical, I believe, which then allowed him some freedom and flexibility to invent novel substances, which he sort of famously experimented with in his backyard with a number of friends. And I want to hear a little bit more sort of anecdotes or stories that you might have about Sasha. But first, I'm curious about Sasha and Ann. And Ann was your mother, and they were a force of nature. And I'm curious just to hear about their love story. How did they meet? When did they meet, and why was their relationship so magical and powerful in the way that it was?
Well, Sasha and Ann, my mom, met at a party in 1978, 79, in that zone. It was put on by a friend of theirs, Kevin Langdon, and they wrote about it in PiHKAL. We pronounce it PiHKAL. PiHKAL, a chemical
PiHKAL,
love
okay,
story.
thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate
And
that.
TiHKAL, the continuation. Those are the two books that they are the first books that they wrote. But they met at that party, and immediately my mom was, I want to know this person. He's so fascinating and just very warm, and yeah, she knew right away, I think, that she really wanted to know him and be with him. And So they started spending time together after that event. And, they do write about this. It was a serious love triangle that was going on. He was in love with somebody else.
Okay.
His wife had died. So he was single and he was really interested in this other woman. And so my mom had to go through a lot to be with him. She really stuck it out, knew that it was worth doing, just the possibility of being able to stay with him. It was worth all the pain she was going through because it was very painful. But as it turned out, they did end up together and he let that other situation go. And yeah, they were an incredible couple. He was really the science mind. She was really the psychology mind. She was very well read and well educated and knew a lot about Jungian psychology, that some of which was from my father, John Perry, who was a Jungian analyst. He studied with Carl Jung in Switzerland. And so, but she'd educated herself on a lot of this. She was very deeply interested in psychology and therapy. And so, they were, Sasha and Ann were a really great team that way. Him being science and her being kind of more the heart in a way, I guess you could say. So they balanced each other out well and respected each other greatly. He really respected her knowledge and her intuition and her sense of things. And of course, vice versa. She was in awe of him and the work that he did. She said when they first met and he described what he did for a living, that he was creating novel psychedelic drugs, she was just floored. She couldn't believe that was something somebody would actually be doing and be able to talk about it. It's very interesting.
I mean, prior to the meeting, did she have any sort of context or experience with MDMA or LSD or some of these psychedelic substances? Or was Sasha the one that introduced her into that world?
She had a mescaline experience with a friend, and that was in San Francisco in the park. They walked around. And so she had touched into that space before, separately. So she was familiar with it. It wasn't scary to her. She was very open-minded about these things as well, of course, and curious, very curious. And I know they made a great team in that realm too. When he would create something new, she was right there to help test it out. After he had gone through his preliminary self-testing, he would give it to her, and then it would go to the research group. So they made a really great team in figuring out if things were worth pursuing, were they interesting, were they, because the question must come up when you're creating something like this and you try it, like, well, what is it you're looking for? What's the magic of this compound? Or is there nothing there? Is it worth taking it to these next levels of having the research group try it and all that? So anyway, they were an amazing team. And we're really in love. And they, one thing about that testing, they always knew, she told us this, that she knew, or they both knew, if something was worth pursuing, if they could make love on it. That was one of their litmus tests. If you can't connect with your person and thus connecting with some deeper part of yourself, then maybe it's not something that's worth doing. So it's interesting.
Which is probably why the 2Cs were some of the most popular or well-known, even, because they have this phenomenal heart-opening aphrodisiac sort of quality to them. I would say those are still, for kind of relational things, one of my favorites to weave in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's and my mom, I think, was the first one to use 2CB in therapy with, this was something when she was working with the hypnotherapist doing psychedelic therapy. She worked with this woman for a while. She did a lot on her own, but particularly working with this woman, they found that when there was a really tough case, like the MDMA, taking MDMA, sometimes you still have that wall inside that you need to break through to get to what you're trying to get to. And they found that a booster of 2CB on top of a boost, like an hour or two in, on top of the MDMA would really help open the person up and let them drop those barriers and get to where they wanted to get to. So yeah, these compounds, there's so much there, so much potential. We haven't even scratched the surface of how these are useful for us, not just therapy, but who knows? I mean,
for relational work, for envisioning, for creativity, for even kind of magic, however one might want to define magic, kind of wizardry.
People are even looking at neuropathy. People are looking at Parkinson's. People are looking at, how these things have affected other neurological disorders and have helped people heal from some serious maladies that the Western medicine just couldn't do anything about. So yeah, a lot of potential and untapped information.
Well, it's almost like what Sasha and Ann created together was this sort of, I almost think of it as like it's like a massive library in a way, where each molecule or each substance is a whole book that we've only read like the first chapter of,
Right.
And, about a year ago on the podcast, we had a gentleman, Dylan DiNardo, who runs this company, Mindstate Design. And we talked about how he's working to utilize potentially AI or LLMs to better understand, like, what are some of these molecules and compounds that are efficacious or could be brought through clinical trials, because it's, there's just so much there that still is to be unpacked and explored, which I think is so exciting in many ways.
Yeah. They're doing interesting work. And Tom Ray is an old friend, and he used to come to the farm. And so, this is another thing about Sasha, was that he was so prolific in his research and his communications with people, just all of the information he would gather. It's an incredible amount of information that is housed right now at the farm. And so he was really generous with that information. And there were people who would come and he would let them, look through his files and his information. He was just very free. He freely shared that, because he really believed that we're all doing this work. We're all in it together, and there's no reason one shouldn't share all of that information so other people can take it further. There just wasn't enough time to do it all. Sasha was, you can only do chemistry so fast. You can only create things so fast, and you can only do so much research and write so many books. And so, yeah, I think in his mind, just let everybody help and support them and what they're doing. They're going to support you in what you're doing. It's really great to see that collaboration.
Yeah, like the collaborative ethos. And I feel like this has now underpinned a lot of the dialogue, even as psychedelics have become more available and more money has come in. As an example of this, Bob Jesse sent out, I don't know if I would classify it as a petition or collected signatures about people who were really behind open science, that open science is at the ethos or part of the psychedelic landscape, rather than the typical pharmaceutical way, which is we're going to patent these, we're going to keep the science for ourselves. It's like the more we can open source this, which is, I think, in spirit of a lot of these psychedelic compounds, the quicker we can actually allow for greater access, the more data we can collect, all these sorts of things. Right. And so Sasha and Ann were sort of, they helped to steward that. They helped that to be part of the ethos of psychedelics.
Definitely. And the people that they were connected to felt very similarly. So yeah, that was, and I'm sad to see the way things have gone a little. I mean, we won't get into it too much because I don't even really know all of the ins and outs of it. But yeah, it's when there is nothing wrong with people making money. People need to make money, and it's a good thing. But when big money entered the scene, the psychedelic realm, it certainly changed things. So I'm hoping it'll kind of get back to, come in the middle a little bit. There's no reason we can't all be collaborating and sharing information and making money. There's something in there. So
yeah, it's like the pie grows bigger when we can all really contribute to it.
Yeah.
And so I visited the farm a few months ago and was able to see the laboratory in the house, and Wendy gave me this beautiful tour. And since that point in time, we've seen the news about FDA rejecting MDMA, which is really unfortunate and a travesty, but also the sort of like, I guess, silver lining that I'm attempting to look at is the psychedelic space has grown so massively in the last 5 years that a lot of people were worried, that we were sort of getting out ahead of the skis a little bit. And so I think it's a good reminder that regardless of what happens with the FDA, the real the sort of beating heart of this psychedelic renaissance is these community efforts. It's open source, it's collaboration, that there's sort of this mycelial wisdom in these medicines. And it doesn't fit so well into this kind of like purely medical, purely FDA paradigm necessarily.
Or purely business oriented. Yeah. Right. Yeah. A friend said recently, which it's interesting, it's the first time I'd heard it since that, well, clearly the medicine didn't want this to happen yet, and we do have to listen to the medicine. We do have to listen to the spirit of what's behind all this. And I think things have been going really fast, and this is a way that everybody just needs to slow down now, go a little more methodically and intentionally. And
totally. Yeah. Slowing down, patience is good. We went too fast in the 60s and we saw what happened there. And so there is a lot of momentum. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot more research coming out. But I think usually the way that I love to think about it is this really is for, the next 7 generations rather than just the next 7 years, and keeping that long-term view in mind.
Right.
It's probably similar to even how you think about the foundation and the Shulgin Farm, where you're not only purely thinking about, the next 3 or 4 years, but you're like, how could we make this something that generations from now people are still able to visit and understand the history of what was created here?
Yeah. Because so I'll give a little backstory on that. When my mom passed away, I'm the executor of the family trust. And, we'd had lots of conversations with Mom and with Sasha somewhat at the end of his life about what was going to happen after they were both gone. And, I think you get to a certain point in life and you kind of don't really care. Mom would express that, well, it would be really great to have this place, the farm, survive and be something. But she couldn't quite see it. But when she passed, I talked to the family and said, I think this is very important that we try to preserve this property. What happened at the farm with Sasha's lab and the research group will never happen in the same way again. The history here is so rich. To sell the property to some stranger and have the house bulldozed, and it would just be such a tragedy, such a loss, because history is important. The story is important, and the farm is part of the larger story. And, Sasha was really quiet. He wasn't a Timothy Leary at first. And it's only from publishing the books that people even knew who they were. Unless you were really on the inside, Sasha was kept pretty quiet. And he was a expert witness for the law enforcement. He was friends with DEA. He was on all sides of the fences because he was a scientist. That was his thing. But anyway, so getting back to the farm, this place is so special, and you really feel it when you walk on the property. I don't know if you had that experience, but walking into the living room where Mom conducted hundreds and hundreds of therapy sessions with, more than just MDMA, and the research group there for years and years coming and trying new things that Sasha created, doing the reports, and they would go to other people's homes too, but it was a lot at the farm. So yeah, the place just feels infused with this history and energy. And yeah, so the history of that place is incredible, and it's been a gathering place for the community for so long, so long. Even before Mom was in the picture, Sasha would have gatherings at Easter. I'm not sure about the 4th of July, but I know at Easter they would have some parties, and with his first wife, Nina. So when Mom came into the picture, those gatherings continued. There was Easter and 4th of July that they would have friends and family come over, and all the therapists and scientists and writers and all the people they knew, or just people who were friends. They weren't professionals of any kind, but this gathering space where people could come and talk about psychedelics and feel safe because they were amongst friends. It was a really important place for people because there aren't many places, or back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, there weren't many places you could go and be with a huge group of people all talking about your work and what you loved and experiences you'd had with certain substances. And
this was like pre-Burning Man for the most part.
Yeah.
Like this was early. And in the thick of prohibition, it was the late 70s, 80s, was not a real friendly time for us type of folks, who were interested in psychedelics and consciousness exploration.
Right. Well, Mom would get up at some of the parties and the Friday night dinners that were another regular event that we would have. But she would get up at these sometimes in the beginning and say, okay, this is the rules. There's no smoking pot. There's no doing drugs. There's no dealing drugs. There's no conspiring to deal drugs, because if you do, we could lose our home. And that was very real at that time. And a lot of younger people don't know this, but yeah, if a police officer came onto the property and somebody's smoking a joint, you could lose your house. Just incredible.
Oh my God.
Incredible. So it was very real.
Wow.
And we always assumed at these parties that there was a DEA agent amongst the crowd, so we were very careful. But there's, it's great. You can talk about whatever you want and you can share information. And so anyway, the farm has been such a hub for the community for so long. And so we want that to continue as well. As my feeling, after Mom passed, my feeling was I really don't want it to be like a museum, with the velvet ropes and looking into Sasha's office. This is where he sat. I want the place to be a living, breathing place that's being used by the community. So meetings and lectures and gatherings and classes. We have all sorts of plans for classes, and we've had some third-party events there already. It's such a great space for that. And so I'm thinking in 100 years, people are going to look at what happened there and be blown away.
Well, I almost think of it as like, there's these UNESCO World Heritage Sites, right? Like Chichen Itza or the Great Pyramids, or I think they started naming these in the 70s or 80s. So I almost see the vision of what the Shulgin Farm would be when psychedelics are, much more accessible and people, on a broad scale get them. It's like, how cool would it be if that became like a UNESCO World Heritage Site where it's like, this like incredible history happened here that helped to introduce psychedelics to a wide swath of people. There was this mad chemist, basically, Sasha Shulgin. And it's sort of like, in a way, it's like a mythical lore that you are preserving and keeping alive for generations from now.
Yeah. And I got to say, it's this archiving project that's been going on for about 8 years now. The Arrowwoods have been spearheading that, and just bless them.
What is that? What's the archiving project that Arrowwood is leading?
As many people say, it's really amazing. Sasha and Ann never threw anything away. And that's really great and really overwhelming. I mean, so going through all of their, not just ephemera, but papers, the Arrowwoods have been digitizing all of Sasha's work and correspondence, and getting it preserved and archived. And eventually the physical archives, most of them will go to Bancroft Library in Berkeley. We've had some meetings with them, and it's just so appropriate that they go there, because Sasha went to Berkeley, he taught at Berkeley, it's nearby, and it just makes so much sense. So a lot of the archives will go to Bancroft Library, but there'll be a lot of things that remain on the farm as well. But this archive project has just been huge. 8 years of scanning and going through things and trying to figure out, they're trying to capture everything, but bank statements, you don't really need to scan all the bank statements. So it's like, what stays, what goes, what's important, what's not. Even cataloging all the books, they're doing that right now, and getting all the digital media, all the media digitized. That's a big project they're still fundraising for. So the Arrowwoods have been incredible, and I don't know what we would do without them.
They've been really a rock. Ooh. They've been running that website as a nonprofit for, probably almost 30 years now, and it's just a compendium. It's an incredible resource for all of this. They've been huge allies in these efforts. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about, like, I imagine you were probably in your teens when teens or early 20s when Sasha and your mom met. Like, I'd love to hear, like, what were maybe some of your initial impressions of this new man that was entering your mom's life? How did you get along with him as a human? Like, how did that relationship grow a little bit as well? I'd be curious to hear you talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, when Mom first met Sasha, I remember when she first brought him to the house, and I was a little skeptical. I was a little wary. Only because, honestly, I did not get his sense of humor. He was so dry. He was a very funny person. He really loved wordplay. He loved teasing people. And he was also a little shy in his own way. So, here comes this man that clearly Mom is over the moon. And so it took me a little bit to understand him and to get him in a way. And after I understood more about him, he's great, and he's funny, and he's really very sweet man. So at first I was a little skeptical, but warmed up to him. And over the years, I got to participate a little bit in the research and did some of my reports, and which I have stumbled upon in the
What was that like? Any sort of interesting experiences or stories that stick out from that time?
Well, this was early, and this is still right before MDMA was illegal, right? Trying things that were analogs of MDMA, it was really interesting to be part of that. like, oh, is this also something that, I mean, it's very structurally close to MDMA, but it's, you take it and then it just doesn't quite have that same heart opening and that same experience of fear dropping away. So, and then trying some of his other compounds, yeah, it was such an honor, first of all, and really fun to be at the farm, because it was usually at the farm, uh, to be there with my mom and Sasha in an altered state and assessing whether this was something, good, like writing up my report about it. It was great. I mean, I had had some of my own experiences in high school before my mom met Sasha, so this was familiar territory for me. But, to put it in the context of science and doing this in this very methodical way and writing about it afterward really changed my whole thinking about it, about the.
And what was the approach? Because I have a sense of it, but probably a lot of our listeners are like not really sure. So
Oh,
how
yeah.
was that approach done? Like,
Yeah.
what was the sort of science of it?
Yeah. So, how it would work with the research group or anybody who was participating in trying a new compound, Sasha would work something new up from, this was something that had never existed on the earth, and he would create it and he would try it in very minute doses and wait a couple of days, try it again, and work it up to a place that it was active and he could get a sense of, is this something that feels good? Is it not good? Does it feel dangerous? And if something felt good and he wanted to bring it to the research group or me or mom or anybody, he would get it to an active threshold. And then the thing was, if you were participating in the research group, you would take the compound and, notes are being taken, what time you're taking it, how much you're taking, and then you have your experience. And after you're starting to come down, or even during, you are taking notes on what you are feeling and what you're thinking about it. And um, any physiological components, psychological components, anything that you could write down about it. There were reports that were expected because this is part of the research. And all of these reports are in these pharmacology notebooks that we have at the farm. So these pharmacology notebooks have not only reports from Sasha and Ann and some of the research group, but other people that would send in their reports about certain compounds. So,
And how many compounds were explored that way? Do you have a sense of?
Well, he created over 200 novel compounds.
Oh, wow.
I don't even really know a solid real number. And some of these,
Okay.
you would never want to touch them. I mean, you wouldn't, some of them, there was a reason they were not pursued, because they, made him sick, or they just weren't pleasant, or didn't feel like they was going to go anywhere.
Right.
So many things. And, it's interesting the way Sasha worked, because he was such a genius with chemistry. It was really the love of his life. I mean, my mom was too, but chemistry was really the love of his life. He was like a kid in the lab. He was just so happy to be there and loved chemistry. But the way he worked, he just figured out patterns, so he would take a compound and its structure, and he would say, okay, if I put another methyl group over here or a bromine group over here or whatever, then it's going to change it. And he had enough information and experience to know, kind of be able to guess what would happen if he changed that structure and made a new compound. But point being that these patterns he found, these ways to work, he really gave this blueprint for future discovery. And Yeah, I think that is one of the most amazing things that he has left is like this way of thinking about it and this understanding that there are so many things yet to be discovered.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That he was just scratching the
Oh,
surface in
yeah.
some ways. That
Oh, yeah. For sure.
Okay.
I mean, I
Okay.
don't think anybody could in one lifetime, you know. Yeah, it's so he was very methodical and very intentional about the way he did everything. He was a scientist through and through. Nothing airy-fairy about it, you know?
Mm.
And, them publishing the books, as I was saying before, he was very private because he wanted to do his work. Yeah, he was on a mission. His mission was to create novel psychedelics, and he knew this is dangerous territory. I mean, you don't want to poke the bear too much. So he had his license, he could do it legally. And, but yes, there was this point in time that he and my mom realized that, all of his work could be lost.
Right.
All of his work could be burned in a fire, whether that's intentional by someone or not. He could lose all that. So they thought, well, in this day and age of such harsh drug laws and information, all that, what's the best way to get your information out there? You publish. So that's how PiHKAL, A Chemical Love Story, was born, was wanting to put the information out there because half of the book is all recipes. And those recipes have...
Which is where the controversy was from.
And there's experience reports in there from him, the research group, other people. So you can read about a compound and its effects, as well as the chemistry. Now, you can't make these things unless you're a chemist, unless you have the precursors.
Right.
It's not that he's necessarily encouraging people to do it, but it's about the information and the information being out there for people to take and utilize in the future. So that's the second half of both books is all chemistry. The first book is all the phenethylamines. Second book, TiHKAL, the continuation, is all tryptamines. But it's fun. The first half of PiHKAL is their love story. And it was brave of them on a lot of levels, not just publishing all the chemistry and putting that out in the world, which was dicey, but also putting themselves out in the world, because it is, there's a good fair amount of sex in there. There's some really brutal honesty about themselves. I was in Japan when I first read PiHKAL. I was selling jewelry on the streets of Japan, and she sent the book, and I was floored at how honest she was, and this kind of brutal honesty about herself and her experiences and her thoughts and feelings. And so they're great books. But yeah, his work is important. And so thank goodness he published, and thank goodness we have the archives, and thank goodness we have Arrowwood to digitize all those archives. And I see this as a legacy that's just going to keep going,
When was PiHKAL published?
1991.
Oh, wow.
91, yeah.
Okay.
And then the DEA visited the farm in 94. And that's the first chapter of the second book, is the visit from the DEA, because it wasn't, they didn't come with guns blaring and their SWAT team at all. They came in their jeans. I was there the day that the DEA came. They call it the raid.
Oh, yeah. What was that like?
Yeah, it was nerve-wracking. Usually Sasha's friend in the DEA would alert him if he was going to have a visit. But they went around everyone that Sasha knew and came to the farm and came up to the door. I remember Sasha being very alarmed, but, calm, because he didn't feel like he had anything to hide. And he really didn't. But the problem was that he and my mom were so disorganized and so overwhelmed with stuff. They were just busy. They were just doing their work all the time. And over years, people had been sending Sasha samples from raves and parties and saying, could you test this and let me know what's in it? I mean, just samples in envelopes all over the place. And so the DA walked around the house and would pull things off of the shelf and look in an envelope and say, oh, this is a $10,000 fine, Dr. Shulgin. Oh, this is a $10,000 fine, Dr. Shulgin. Oh, just endless. These things are supposed to be in a safe, and cataloged, and, So that experience was harsh, but I don't think it was because of them publishing PiHKAL and TiHKAL. I think it's because they were doing interviews in places like High Times and magazines, and Sasha would talk about his Schedule I license and how he can do this legally, and I think that was where the DEA got egg on their face. So they wanted to put a stop to that. So it wasn't about putting Sasha away. People really respect Sasha. The DEA really respected him, but they didn't like that. And so they wanted to put an end to his Schedule I license. And that's what he ended up having to do, was get rid of his license and pay a big fine.
That sucks.
Yeah.
The DEA sucks.
Yeah. They're just doing their job.
Life would be better without the DEA.
Yeah.
Let's be clear. Well, and it's interesting that you were there on that day. I mean, I've read bits of PiHKAL and TiHKAL. I need to read them properly. One book I did read that I think was published by Transform Press was some of the lectures that Sasha gave to his class.
Nature of
about
drugs.
The Nature of Drugs, which was a really, really fantastic book.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you now own Transform Press, which was that the publishing company that published PiHKAL and TiHKAL then?
So this is the story about that, is that when Mom and Sasha first wrote PiHKAL, they shopped it around. Tarcher was almost going to take it. He was interested, but it was just too hot a subject. It was just too risky. So a friend of theirs told them how to start their own publishing company. So Transform Press is Mom and Sasha's publishing company that they started. So when I first started working with Sasha, I started working with him after being overseas, and for a while I came back and started working with him in the lab and in the office and running Transform Press. So this friend was amazing, that just told him how to create the press, how to publish the books, how to track everything, and it's been going ever since. So Transform Press has been mine since Sasha was sick, and they just said, well, you've been running it. You take it and take care of it. So it was given to me to run. And so the Nature of Drugs books, that was a very long project. That's a funny story, in that Sasha was teaching this class at San Francisco State, and my mom would come to each class with a cassette recorder, and she would just hit play and she would record the class. And so she had that whole class documented, and it took a long time to transcribe those tapes and get it right and get it into a readable sort of form. It's really fun to read them. I don't know if you've heard Sasha lecture before, or you've probably seen videos of him, but you can really...
I've seen videos.
Yeah, you can really hear him, kind of get his cadence and his voice, so to speak, in those books. And because he was a fantastic teacher, just lively, and he would go way too fast. He had this story about teaching at Berkeley, and he said there was this one girl. He tells this story actually in the Nature of Drugs book. There was a girl sitting in the front row of one of his lecture halls, and he said she was a beautiful, like, litmus test for him, that if he was going way too fast, she would get this look on her face and tears would start rolling down her cheeks, and he knew he had to slow down. And so he would use this girl as sort of this means to tell if he was just going a barometer if he was going too fast, because he just he would go very fast.
He would just go. I mean, yeah, you're just in it, and it's just he's probably was so he was so brilliant that it's just channeling through.
Exactly.
And it's a ton of fun to be able to do that. So that's a nice it's a nice little anecdote.
Yeah. So
we're go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so Transform Press is still going, and we still have one more book in the series of the nature of drugs. There's 2 right now, and there's a 3rd that we're still working on.
Do you know when that might come out? Next year, maybe?
Not next year. I think we're on the slow track for that. It's hard. I mean, balancing out. I have another job that I do 3 days a week at a chiropractic office, which I absolutely love being there. And so Transform Press and this and the farm project, it's a lot. So Transform Press has taken a little bit of a back seat while we're trying to preserve the farm. This is really an important project I'm on, and so it's taking precedence.
I get that. Well, let's finish up with that. Like, let's talk about the kind of fundraising goal and what is it that you're currently sort of, what's the goal? What's the objective? Just kind of, especially for audience members who would love to support or just be a little bit more aware. What does it look like from a fundraising perspective, and what's maybe your goal with the property itself?
Our goal with the property itself is to really kind of maintain and preserve the house and the lab as much as possible. So it's kind of set in time a little bit, but still utilizing it. But there is another structure on the property we call the barn, which is a big space that's sort of like our blank canvas that is going to be where most events are going to be. Like you can sit 80 to 100 people in there. When the archives are out, we'll be able to do this. But so there's a lot of work to do at the farm. But our fundraising goal is we're trying to raise $3 million, and that is to for the nonprofit Shulgin Farm nonprofit to purchase the property from the family, so it's held in perpetuity in this nonprofit entity. So the $3 million will be partly to the family, and then a reserve fund and an improvement fund. So it's really important that the barn needs a lot of work. There are things that need to happen on the property to make it really an appropriate space, a good space for events to happen. And then a reserve account is just a really smart and necessary thing to do. So once the nonprofit owns the farm, it'll be a lot better. We're about 1/10 of the way, 15% of the way right now, which is good. It's been going really well. We have embarked on something we call this Seed Crystal Steward Program. And our idea, at first, I really didn't want to create a nonprofit. We were looking at perpetual purpose trusts models. We were looking at all sorts of different models. But the feeling was that, this is a community space and we want the community to own it. So we're not going to 1 to 5 people to donate big sums of money. We're trying to get as many people to donate towards it as possible so that everyone has a sense of ownership, because it really is for everyone. And so the Seed Crystal Steward Program, people can read about it on the website at shulginfarm.org. But it's at $10,000, you are a seed crystal steward. And the seed crystal is a chemical term where you have a solution and you wanting it to crystallize. So you put a little seed crystal into the solution, and it encourages and helps crystals form. And it was Matt Baggett who wrote a paper about Sasha, that he was like the seed crystal of the psychedelic world.
That's a beautiful
frame. Because of him, so much else has happened and born out of his work. And so the Seed Crystal Steward program is going well, and we have quite a few people who are seed crystal donors. But of course, it's any amount is welcome, and we need to start looking at bigger donors too now, because it's raising money. It's not easy.
Not easy all the time.
But there's so much support and so much love for this. People really get it.
Yeah,
they get the importance of the farm, the importance of its place in history and the Shulgins' legacy, and it's so. I feel like we're in good hands. There's a lot of love and support for what we're trying to do. It's just time.
It's time. So that's shulginfarm.org. You'll see Capital Campaign at the top. You can click there to get more details about how to support. I know, Wendy, you're also doing some events at the farm. So there's a social presence that folks can follow, and every now and then you'll post updates there about, I think, like you're hosting something with the Deva Collective, like a women's summit, women's health summit in a couple of weeks from our recording. So in case folks are interested or curious about visiting and see, you usually have, if there is an event that you're hosting that's more publicly available, that's a great time to be able to go to the farm and check it out.
Yeah, our social media presence is Shulgin Foundation. Foundation. And we started with the foundation because we thought we were going to work with that, but as creating the nonprofit, we saw that this is really about the farm, and the foundation is an entity that we intend to be like a DBA of the farm. But it is a little confusing for people, but rest assured, the two entities are one. And it's the shulginfarm.org is really the place to go.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, sharing, some rich history about your mom and about Sasha and your relationship and everything you're doing with the farm. Folks, check out shulginfarm.org or follow them with the Shulgin Foundation, and share this with a friend or two if you think they may be interested in what Wendy is helping to support with the Shulgin Farm out in Lafayette. So Wendy, thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been really fun. Thank you.
Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Wendy Tucker. If you're inspired by the preservation efforts at Shulgin Farm, you can learn more and support their work at shulginfarm.org. That's SHULGIN farm.org. This is a piece of psychedelic history worth preserving for future generations. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mentioned in this episode. And we'd love to know what you thought of this conversation. And you can let us know on our free platform at community.thethirdwave.co. Make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode inspiring or helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.